Hello and welcome to my video on how to knit stripes. I'm going to show you how to knit a very small narrow stripe whilst flat knitting with straight needles. So far I've done several rows of ribbing and now I'm going to do a knit row and purl row of red yarn. To do this I'm going to take the end of the red yarn and loop it over by at least about 3 inches. I'm then going to take my right hand needle and go into the first stitch as if I'm going to knit it. But instead of knitting with the main white colour, I then pick up the loop of red yarn and put it over the back needle tip. I keep the tail end of the red yarn at the back and the working yarn at the front. The first row I'm going to do is just knit stitches. So I'm going to hold on to the loop of red yarn and then I'm going to knit with it as I normally would knit with any yarn. For the first 2 or 3 stitches you'll find that you'll need to tighten up the yarn a bit to make sure that it's not too loose on the edges. You'll want to make sure that the red yarn is nice and secure. After the first few stitches, you should just be able to knit as normal and not have to worry about the loose yarn. So I'm knitting with a double thickness. This means that as you're knitting, you're also at the same time weaving in the tail end of the red yarn, which will secure it in place. You'll want to knit with the double thickness of yarn for about 4 stitches, just to make sure that the red yarn is secure, and then you can leave the tail end of the red yarn at the back of the knitting and carry on working with just the working yarn. You can cut off the excess of this yarn tail later. So now I'm just knitting the first row using that red yarn. And all of these stitches are just the normal knit stitches. So all you do is do the knit stitches all across the row. If you don't like the double thickness of knitting, then you can instead leave the tail end loose and just knit with the working yarn. If you're going to do this, be sure to leave a tail which is at least 4 or 5 inches long. You're going to need a bit of extra length because you're going to be weaving in that tail end of yarn later with a needle. So there are 2 ways of doing it. You either do the double thickness of yarn and weave it in as you knit, or you leave the tail loose without knitting it in and then weave it in later on with a needle. At the end of this knit row, just take note that the working yarn in the main colour, i.e. the white colour yarn, is now leaving at the bottom of your work, i.e. at the bottom of your needles. I will come back to this later, so it's just something to note. What I'm going to do is do a row of purl stitches now because I want the overall effect to be the stockinette stitch. If you don't know what the stockinette stitch is, it's where you do 1 row knit stitch, 1 row purl stitch, 1 row knit stitch, 1 row purl stitch, etc, etc, alternating them to give a certain look of knitting. So all I'm going to do is just go back along the row doing purl stitches. At the end of your purl stitch row you have 2 options. One option, which I'm going to show you, is where you cut the red yarn to leave a tail of at least 4 inches, but probably more like 5 or 6 inches, and then weave in that tail end to secure it. This is good if you are just doing the 1 stripe, or you're just doing the 1 stripe in this particular colour, or you're going to be doing a lot more of the main colour, in this case white, before you do another stripe. However, if you plan on doing another red stripe within 3, 4, 5 more rows, then it might well be best to carry the red yarn along the edge of your knitted work. This isn't so good if you're doing a reversible piece of knitting in that you don't want to see the red yarn being carried up the edge of the back of your knitting. However, if you're only going to be seeing the front of your knitting, then this is a great technique and saves you from weaving in loads of yarn ends. If you're planning on carrying the yarn, then what you will now do is go back to knitting with your main colour, in this case white. And to do that, you would just take the working yarn of the main colour over the yarn of the secondary colour, in this case red, and just continue knitting with the main colour as usual. You don't change the yarn, you don't cut the yarn, you don't do anything. It's just a simple little basic twist by putting the white yarn over the red. You then knit all the rows you want to knit in the main colour, in this case white, before going back to knitting in the contrasting colour, in this case red. I will be doing a different video on how to carry the yarn along the edge of your knitted work, so stay tuned for that. But the method I'm going to show you now is how to weave the end of the red yarn into your knitting, and to do this I'm going to cut the red yarn with at least I would say a 5 or 6 inch tail, preferably more like 8 inches just to be on the safe side. You then thread this yarn tail through a yarn needle and you then weave it into the back of your knitted work. You want to start weaving in as close as possible to where the tail leaves your knitting, and you want the yarn to blend in as much as possible to your knitting. You do this by following the path that the other yarn has taken through your knitted work. So you therefore take your yarn tail through a series of loops. This diagram shows the order of the loops. You choose one horizontal bar to start from. I've labelled this A, and you go under this piece of yarn, which is the top of a loop. You then go under the loop titled B, and then down through the loop titled C, and then back down and under the loop titled A. So you do a full circle of a loop. You then do this for another 3 or 4 loops just to secure the end of the red yarn. So you then go up and under loop D, up and under loop E, down under loop F, and then back under loop D again. And you carry on just like that across the row, going from the edge of your knitting inwards. So you then go up and under G, up and under H, down through I, and then down through G again. And then up and under J, up and under K, down through L, and down through J again. To finish weaving in, all you have to do is cut off the excess of yarn. You can weave in yarn tail ends as you're working on your knitted project, or you can wait until you finish your project and then weave all the yarn tails in at once. It's completely up to you. You would then go back to knitting with your main colour and keep following your pattern. Here you can see how the stripe looks after I've done another row or 2 of the main colour in white, and you can see it's 2 rows wide. One last note I want to add is about the width of the stripes you're going to knit. When you're knitting flat knitting, you'll nearly always find that stripes are an even number of rows wide. This is because in flat knitting you're knitting back and forth, so you need that even number of rows in order to come back to where you came from. Now before I said to take note of where the white working yarn was at the end of that first knit stitch row. It was at the bottom of the needles. So if you only wanted to do that first knit stitch row in the red and then go back to the white, you'd end up trying to take the white working yarn from the bottom of the needles, which just wouldn't work. That's why I did a knit stitch row and then a purl stitch row, 2 rows, because it brought me back to where the white working yarn was. It is possible to do an odd number of rows, but you would need to cut the white working yarn, i.e. the main colour, and then rejoin it to your knitting again, as if you were joining a new colour. This is obviously not ideal. In circular knitting, however, when you're using circular needles or double pointed needles and knitting in the round, you can do a stripe of any width. This is because you're only ever knitting the front of your knitting, just the one side, and you're going round and round, not back and forth. Just thought I'd add that little bit of extra information at the end, in case you were wondering how you would do an odd number of rows. Thanks very much for watching.